All right, so good evening. Thanks to those of you who are joining live. I appreciate it. Those of you who are watching the recording, I appreciate it as well. My name is Dr. Josh Franco, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Cuyamaca College. Welcome to our workshop on global conflict and cooperation. So this workshop is a series that's focused on defining, exploring, and discussing global conflict and cooperation from the point of view of different international institutions, country governments, and international non-governmental organizations. This has been our schedule for the summer. So we started with Summit of the Americas, and then the second week, Ukraine, following week, oceans. And then last week, we talked about NATO. This week, we'll be talking about the country of Iran. And I'm going to jump to that slide. So week 5, Iran. Here is a Google Earth picture of Iran. And I'm going to point out a couple of things here to kind of get us situated geographically. So here's the country. Tehran is the capital, somewhere in this area. We have Azerbaijan to this part, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, and Kuwait. And so we can see here that Iran is like kind of at this crossroads geographically. It's at the heart of the Middle East, or what we know as the Middle East. Obviously borders Turkey as well over here. But kind of this bridge between the greater Asian continent and European continent and the African continent. So Iran has a rich history, which we'll learn about, and then we'll talk about conflict and cooperation and some implications. So let's jump right in. So our learning objectives is to identify where it is in the world, describe history related to Iran and Iran's nuclear program, explain a real-world example of conflict, a real-world example of cooperation, and describe the implications of Iran's nuclear program. So a little bit about Iran. Here on the left-hand side is a political map that shows different regions and different or major towns and cities within the country of Iran. So again, Tehran is here, which is the capital, Tabriz in the north, Shadabahar in the south, and then a range of other towns and cities throughout. Note here that it does border the Caspian Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Straits of Hormuz, the Gulf of Oman, and the broader Arabian Sea. And in addition to those larger countries that we talked about, we also see that we have Bahrain, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and Oman to the south of Iran. I do point out that this geography not only is central to 3 major continents, but it's also central to a lot of energy that's produced in the region, particularly oil production and petroleum. And on the right-hand side is the national flag of Iran. What I'd like to do is pull up the CIA World Fact Book, which is a publicly available resource. And CIA has made this public since, I don't know, 15, 20 years that I've known. I remember coming across like a hard copy of this. And I was like, oh, wow, there's like all these facts and figures. So what I'll do is I'll have this background of Iran read. And obviously it's pointing, from a perspective, but I think does a reasonable job in just offering an introduction to any country in the world, maybe regardless of the kind of geopolitical implications, even though they're mentioned. So I'll go ahead and play that.
Known as Persia until 1935, Iran became an Islamic republic in 1979 after the ruling monarchy was overthrown and Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was forced into exile. Conservative clerical forces led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini established a theocratic system of government with ultimate political authority vested in a learned religious scholar referred to commonly as the supreme leader who, according to the constitution, is accountable only to the Assembly of Experts, AOE, a popularly elected 88-member body of clerics. U.S.-Iranian relations became strained when a group of Iranian students seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran in November 1979 and held embassy personnel hostages until mid-January 1981. The U.S. cut off diplomatic relations with Iran in April 1980. During the period 1980-88, Iran fought a bloody, indecisive war with Iraq that eventually expanded into the Persian Gulf and led to clashes between U.S. Navy and Iranian military forces. Iran has been designated a state sponsor of terrorism and was subject to US, UN, and EU economic sanctions and export controls because of its continued involvement in terrorism and concerns over possible military dimensions of its nuclear program until Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action at JCPOA implementation day in 2016. The US began gradually reimposing sanctions on Iran after the US withdrawal from JCPOA in May 2018. Following the election of reformer Hojat Oleslam Mohamed Khatami as president in 1997 and a reformist Miles legislature in 2000, a campaign to foster political reform in response to popular dissatisfaction was initiated. The movement floundered as conservative politicians, supported by the supreme leader, unelected institutions of authority like the Council of Guardians, and the security services reversed and blocked reform measures while increasing security repression. Starting with nationwide municipal elections in 2003 and continuing through Miles elections in 2004, conservatives re-established control over Iran's elected government institutions, which culminated with the August 2005 inauguration of hardliner Mahmoud Ahmadinejad as president. His controversial re-election in June 2009 sparked nationwide protests over allegations of electoral fraud, but the protests were quickly suppressed. Deteriorating economic conditions due primarily to government mismanagement and international sanctions prompted at least two major economically based protests in July and October 2012, but Iran's internal security situation remained stable. President Ahmadinejad's independent streak angered regime establishment figures, including the supreme leader, leading to conservative opposition to his agenda for the last year of his presidency, and an alienation of his political supporters. In June 2013, Iranians elected a centrist cleric Dr. Hassan Faridun Rouhani to the presidency. A longtime senior member in the regime, he made promises of reforming society and Iran's foreign policy. In July 2015, Iran and the 5 permanent members, plus Germany, P5+1, signed the JCPOA, under which Iran agreed to restrictions on its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. However, the US reimposed sanctions in 2018, dealing a blow to Rouhani's legacy and the Iranian economy. Negotiations to restore the deal started in 2021 and are ongoing. Iran held elections in February 2020 for the Miles and the president in June 2021, resulting in a hardline and conservative monopoly across the regime's elected and unelected institutions. President Ibrahim Raisi is a hardline cleric with a decades-long career in Iran's judiciary and has had limited foreign policy and economic experience.
So that background brings us to today. And what we'll do next is go in more depth into Iran's nuclear program. And the reason we're focusing on this is because this has kind of been the centerpiece of America's perspective and view of foreign policy towards the country of Iran and the government of Iran. So what I'll do next, I'll pull up a Wikipedia page on Iran's nuclear program. And I'm going to go and have kind of summarize this last part here. So I'm going to bring us into 2007 into right around here, because I'll set us up for the rest of this. Let's see if the voice is working. It's a little laggy. I'll go ahead and read it. So in 2007, the United States National Intelligence Estimate stated that Iran halted an alleged active nuclear weapons program in the fall of 2003. In November 2011, the IAEA, which is the International Atomic Energy Agency, reported credible evidence that Iran had been conducting experiments aimed at designing a nuclear bomb until 2003, and that research may have continued on smaller scale after that time. In May of 2018, the IAEA reiterated its 2015 report, saying it had found no credible evidence of nuclear weapons activity in Iran after 2009. Iran's first nuclear power plant, the Bushehr 1 reactor, was completed with major assistance from the Russian government agency Rosatom and officially opened in September 12, 2011. The Russian engineering contractor said that the Bushehr nuclear power plant would reach full capacity by the end of 2012. Iran has also announced it's working with at least 360 megawatt Darkovan nuclear power plant, and it will seek more medium-sized nuclear power plants and uranium mines in the future. As of 2015, the Iran nuclear program has cost $100 billion in lost oil revenues and lost foreign direct investment because of international sanctions. And as of February 2019, the IAEA certified that Iran was still abiding by the International Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action of 2015. However, in July of 2019, after the United States withdrew from the agreement, the IAEA stated that Iran had breached the agreement. So why does this matter? Well, if you think about the Middle East as a whole, there is limited nuclear power in that area. We know Israel, Pakistan, Russia, if you get far up north enough, basically your nuclear powers in that place. And whenever a country goes nuclear, it changes the entire geopolitical calculus for that region and for arguably the entire world, largely for three reasons. The first one is that once a country has nuclear power and the capacity to develop nuclear weapons, their stature on the world stage just elevates because now they're part of the nuclear club. Obviously, the United States, Russia, France, several countries in Europe, and the ones I mentioned earlier are part of that nuclear club. And so once a country enters into that, they are able to negotiate stronger. The second level is that it changes the geopolitical dynamics in the particular region that nuclear power is located in. So, for example, once it became clear that North Korea had some nuclear weapons capability, it changed the United States' kind of geopolitical posturing in the North Pacific, and it's changing other countries' postures like South Korea and and Japan, among others. The last point is that it basically takes resources away from other things that can be invested in. So this is what we call the classic guns and butter argument. Like you can either invest in weapons and defense and arms, or you can invest in agriculture and manufacturing and other domestic products. So as Iran is in making these decisions, it'll impact its stature at the global level, at the regional level, and then at the domestic level. So in 2014, President Obama shared that after years of negotiating, that they reached an agreement with the country of Iran and European countries to basically have the country of Iran not develop its nuclear weapons program and have some kind of nuclear operating capacity, or very limited, and to basically be overseen by the International Atomic Energy Commission or agency, to make sure that the country of Iran wasn't developing any nuclear materials that could be used in a weapons capacity. 3 years later, then President Trump said that the United States was going to be leaving that joint agreement and then reimposing sanctions. So, in other words, Iran has always had these kind of nuclear aspirations, and then it basically came under heavy sanctions, which is they couldn't do financing, or they couldn't get agricultural products or do general trade. And the United States used those sanctions and say, we'll take those sanctions off of you if you promise to not develop nuclear weapons and to agree to oversight from an international body. They said, okay. But then years later, the next president says, we're going to withdraw the U.S. from this joint agreement and we're going to reimpose the sanctions. And what we're seeing now is kind of Iran's getting closer to, if it hasn't already, reach these kind of nuclear capacities, which would change this entire calculus that we talked about a moment ago. So where's the conflict? Well, the conflict comes in, at least from the American perspective and the European perspective, is, can we get a new nuclear deal with Iran so that it doesn't develop nuclear weapons? And there's an article in The Hill, which is a major newspaper in Washington, D.C., that basically shares the sentiment that most lawmakers, whether they're Democrat or Republican, feel like a new deal is unlikely. Basically, that Iran's gone too far in the development of its program, that no agreement would be reached, and if it is reached, it'll be too late. The next one is the U.S. State Department's and how they've been reimposing those sanctions under the Biden administration. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up that article here and see if this will read as well. And it doesn't look like it wants to read either. So I'll read this. So the United States has designated 15 individuals and entities that engage in illicit sales and shipment of Iranian petroleum products, and petrochemical products. These entities located in Iran, Vietnam, Singapore, and the United Arab Emirates and Hong Kong have supported Iranian energy trade, generating millions of dollars worth of illicit revenue. And this is from the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, and it goes on to describe what the State Department is doing And if you want more information, you can check out this press release. So you might be asking, okay, what are these sanctions, right? Sanctions are basically a way for countries to penalize other countries for their behavior. In this case, the United States, along with other partners, largely in Europe, um, are imposing sanctions on Iran's petroleum industry. So we know petroleum or oils can be sold around the world. It generates revenues, it generates profits for the industries that have it and the countries that are host to those industries. And so the United States said, we're imposing sanctions. Europeans are imposing sanctions or restrictions. And by doing that, the idea is to reduce the revenue that's coming into the government of Iran and making it harder for them to operate, do business, provide services to their public, etc. And the idea is to make it clear that the cause of these sanctions isn't the people of Iran, right? It's the government of Iran and the foreign policy of Iran. So this is an example of conflict. Anytime one country will impose sanctions on another country, that should be viewed as conflictual in nature. Now, in addition to conflict, we also have examples of cooperation. So I'll pull up two things here. The first one is with respect to the Ukrainian conflict and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and this kind of broader geopolitical instability that's happening in Eastern Europe, Western Asia, and now starting to kind of permeate throughout broader parts of that area. So let's go and pull up this New York Times article. So title is, Putin looking for allies, plans to meet leaders of Turkey and Iran. In a second diplomatic push since Russia invaded Ukraine, Putin will travel to Tehran to build bridges between leaders at odds over Syria, oil, and the West. So in his first trip abroad since Russia invaded Ukraine, President Vladimir Putin recently compared himself to Peter the Great, held court amongst his close allies in Central Asia, and insisted that the war was going according to plan. His second trip, announced by the Kremlin on Tuesday, will take him it's a far more difficult diplomatic train. Meetings next week in Tehran with the leaders of Iran and Turkey, two nations sometimes aligned and sometimes sharply at odds with Russia and each other. And if the meetings, if they go well for Putin, represent an opportunity to shore up military and economic backing to counter the West's military assistance to Ukraine and its sanctions against Russia. So this is an example of cooperation because in this case, Russia is reaching out, meeting with the leaders of Iran and Turkey, and he's trying to build this cooperative relationship with them. What those dynamics would be, it might be on oil production, it might be serving as a kind of a conduit for Russia to send its petroleum through so that it can be sold on the open market. It might be to try to create some pressures, either covert or overt, in other parts of the region so that it takes resources away from the Ukrainian front. So there's a lot of different moves that can be played here. But in essence, the Russian government is trying to partner or cooperate with the Iranian government to help it in its broader effort. And in this case, the crushing sanctions that the country of Russia and its government have experienced over the past now 4 or 5 months due to its invasion of Ukraine. Like, how can they wiggle out of that so that they have some space? In addition to that type of conflict, I'll pull up this next one, which is France sees weeks to save Iranian nuclear deal, but the U.S. sets no deadline. So let's go ahead and pull that up. Of course, my article limits there. In this case, the issue is that so under the Obama administration, there was a desire for the U.S. to work with its European allies to reach an agreement with Iran for it to not develop its nuclear program or to be able to develop nuclear weapons. That was in place, or at least was working to get in place for a few years. And then President Trump was elected, and he said the U.S. is not going to be a party to that agreement anymore, and they're going to reimpose sanctions. Europe never walked away from the table, at least from what I can recall. They wanted to stay with that agreement and try to work with the Iranian government so that they wouldn't develop nuclear weapons or the capacity for them. So they've been at it for all this time. After President Trump loses election, President Biden comes in. He says, we're going to try again to develop these connections. Part of the challenge here is that when you have one president set into motion a policy and another president basically reverses, it's kind of hard to go back, especially when time passes. And in that time, a country can be like, I think we're going to go back to developing our nuclear program because y'all are agreeing to the agreement. We have sanctions. We're under pressure. We have domestic pressures. We're having change in leadership, as you heard from the new president that was just elected in Iran last year. So all these moving parts, it kind of makes it hard to like put it back together again. And so this is an example of cooperation, but on this end, it's France wanting to see cooperation with Iran and France wanting to see cooperation with the US, saying, hey, we all got to work together here. If we're going to have this joint agreement actually go into place with the intention that we avoid a conflict going forward. But time will tell in this instance of where we're headed. So all in all, it's like, what are some of the implications of this? Well, some kind of really interesting news came out just yesterday or the day before. So one of the lead officials for the White House, in this case, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, went to the press room and he gave a briefing about what was going on in the region, and he made this what I thought was a stunning claim that the country of Iran was preparing to send several hundred drones to Russia. Now, when I read the headline, I was like, "Whoa, that's pretty big news." And it wasn't a lot of talk about it because there's like 5 other pieces of news that took over the headlines yesterday, including the James Webb Telescope and the images. But what I'll do is I'll play a little bit of National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's press briefing so we can hear a little bit of that. There might be an ad here, so apologize. Yeah. Let the ad go through.
National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan gave an update on intelligence reports that suggest Iran is preparing to supply military weapons and training to aid Russia in their attack on Ukraine. His comments came as he joined Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre at the White House to preview the president's upcoming trip to the Middle East. This is 50 Minutes.
So we won't listen to the whole thing. We'll just listen to that first part.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you. All right. Today we have Jake Sullivan, the President's National Security Advisor. Jake is here to preview the President's upcoming trip to the Middle East, where he will build on a new and more promising chapter of America's engagement in the region. And I'm going to let Jake take it away, and also he'll take some questions afterwards. Jake, it's all yours.
Thank you, Karine, and thanks, everybody. I'm going to lay out a little bit of the context for this trip, make a couple of comments on tomorrow's bilateral meeting with President López Obrador of Mexico, and then I'll be happy to take your questions. But I appreciate you bearing with me as I try to lay out some of the elements of the President's thinking as we head into this very important trip. Tomorrow, President Biden will depart on a trip to Israel, the West Bank, and Saudi Arabia, where he will attend a major Middle Eastern summit. This trip will reinforce a vital American role in a strategically consequential region. And also, it will reinforce that our role is different today than it was 20 years ago on the eve of the war in Iraq. This trip comes after a series of engagements with Indo-Pacific leaders in May, with Latin American leaders at the Summit of the Americas in early June, and with European leaders at the G7 and NATO summits in late June. It is his first trip to the Middle East as president. It is precisely because the world is becoming more geopolitically competitive, especially in the Indo-Pacific and Europe, that we need to remain intensively engaged in the Middle East. The Middle East is deeply interwoven with the rest of the world. And if we act now to create a more peaceful and stable region, it will pay dividends for the American national interest and for the American people for years to come. President Biden's fundamental objectives when it comes to the Middle East are straightforward. A region with more stability and fewer wars that could draw the United States in. A region that is less hospitable to terrorism that threatens Americans. a region that is helping address global energy security at a moment when Russia's war against Ukraine is roiling global energy markets, a region where no foreign power can dominate or gain strategic advantage over the United States, a region that is making progress towards greater human rights and greater human dignity. And despite ongoing challenges, the Middle East President Biden will be visiting is more stable than the one we inherited 18 months ago. We inherited a war in Yemen that was causing widespread death and suffering. We now have had more than 3 months of a ceasefire in Yemen, the longest peace in 7 years. In Iraq, we kept up pressure on ISIS, significantly degrading their capabilities, including by taking out its emir, allowing us to end the U.S. combat mission and transition our military presence in Iraq to focus on training Iraqis. We've reunited our partners to ensure that it's Iran, not the United States, that is isolated until it returns to the nuclear deal. And the frequency of Iranian-sponsored attacks against our forces in Iraq and Syria has dropped dramatically. We've reestablished diplomatic ties with the Palestinians that had basically severed under our predecessor. Working with Congress, we've restored approximately $500 million in support for Palestinians, and we've reaffirmed unequivocal U.S. support for a two-state solution, which had come into question over the previous 4 years.
So National Security Advisor Sullivan goes on to detail kind of what is going on, what President Biden's view and vision is, and really kind of bringing everyone up to date on thinking in the region from the United States' perspective. And so I share that, and obviously I'll post a link in the chat if you want to watch the rest of it. This was a major statement that came out because it's the first time that kind of all these thoughts were put together and weaved together, especially given the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has upset a lot of balance around the world. So, so with that, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and move us to our discussion. I appreciate you guys taking the time to listen in, and I look forward to chatting with you. So take care and have a good evening.